Xavier Milei agrees on a new IMF loan of $20 billion and U-turns on his original plan to dollarize the economy. What are the implications of this U-turn for the Argentinian people? And was Milei's plan even a good idea in the first place? From our chat with Michae Roberts, a renowned Marxist economist, a thesis seems to emerge. The promise of dollarizing the economy was mostly a political move to gain consensus from an electorate concerned about the purchasing price of their currency. It would not have served the real interest of Argentinian working classes, but it proved a winning electoral move, yet not sustainable for the lack of dollar reserves. Milei was then forced to follow the standard path of many Argentinian previous governments. Get a new loan to sustain the value of the pesos, winning the sympathy of international leaders by cutting the welfare state and imposing a cut in real wages for the working class. This move is likely to end up in an indirect subsidy to capital flight, worsening Argentina's dependence on foreign debt and perpetuating a vicious dynamic of foreign loans, cuts and wage deflation.
Good afternoon, everybody. We are back again with Professor Roberts and Paolo. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Hi. And today we would like to talk about the recent developments in Argentina. There has been in April an agreement of a new loan via the IMF. And we do have a pretty tight schedule, so I will let Paolo start with the questions today. And so, yeah, let's go.
Thank you, Carlo, and thank you, Robert, for your presence. My first question is the question of someone who's completely uninitiated to the mysteries of the science of economics. So my first question is, based on the article that you sent us, what is precisely the exchange rate between two currencies? How does it work? And in the case of Argentina, what does the will of the government of creating a band within which the exchange rate should fluctuate entail?
Yes, well, as you know, everybody who's doing exporting and importing or buying goods or going on a tour around another country as a tourist or business may exchange their currencies. If they're in Italy, they've got the euro, that's what they use in Italy. That value of that euro can be related to the value of the dollar or the UK sterling or other currencies around the world. And so the exchange rate is the rate that how many dollars you get for €1 and vice versa. So that's the exchange rate. That's crucial for those people who are doing a lot of exporting and importing, because if the value of their own currency, so if it's the euro, or in the case of Argentina, the peso is very high in terms of dollars, then it's very difficult to sell goods abroad if you've got a very strong currency, and that would mean that your possible purchases of your goods, if you're an exporter, would be reduced because the price of those goods in their currencies is too high, and they'll look elsewhere. So exporters want to keep their currencies low, and the exchange rate provides them, if they can keep the exchange rate low, then they can export a lot. On the other hand, if the exchange rate is low and the value of the currency that you're working in is low, and imports that therefore in other currencies are very expensive. So in the case of Argentina, they import a lot of goods. They run a deficit on their trade, and that trade deficit is quite large. So it means if they want to import a lot of goods from other countries, particularly goods that are going to be priced in dollars, then it's going to be very expensive in pesos. So you have a real problem here. In order to try and finance a trade deficit, which Argentina has for many years, and also to cover the loans that they make to try and keep their economy going, which is what they've been doing over decades, and have to pay those loans back and service those loans, They want a stable currency, a peso against the dollar, so that they can work out how much that's going to cost. But what's happened is the peso's dramatically fallen over the years. Foreign exchange reserves have disappeared. They're mainly held in dollars. And so this has created a continual and perennial problem of debt servicing for the Argentine economy. The answer is to get rid of inflation by controlling the peso dollar exchange rate and trying to reduce the debt by having sufficient FX reserves, that's dollar reserves, to finance the debts that they've built up over the decades. They've not been able to do that for decades. Now, the current government, Milei government, has managed to get a deal out of the International Monetary Fund for a further loan to build up its reserves. It's also getting short-term loans from other countries, particularly China, and it's building up a pile of dollar reserves or reserves to back the peso currency, and therefore try to control the value of the currency so that it doesn't become inflationary at home and it's still at a reasonable price to sell exports. So they tried to fix this price. Now, up to now, before that happened, there were two peso price exchange rates. There was the official one set by the government, which implied that the peso was strong, and the real one, which everybody was working with, which was much lower relative to the dollar, much lower, and the gap between the two was very large. So that meant that the export prices were cheaper, but import prices were much higher. So inflation fed into the Argentine economy. So the government's now trying, with the backing of the IMF and other loans that it's built up over the next year, to try and maintain a certain stability for the peso against the dollar. So it's fixed a band, something like 1,170 pesos to the US dollar, and it up or down a little bit on each side, and it wants to stay in that band. If the peso starts falling, then it will buy pesos with its dollar reserves and try to keep it in the band. If the peso rises, then it will sell pesos to keep the peso dollar rate in this range so that it's still competitive. That's its aim. And that is hoping with the reserves that it's built up or got loaned from the IMF and other countries that it will be able to do that. This band that they've set is going to be very difficult to sustain because before it happened, the dollar reserves are disappearing pretty fast. And now it's going to depend on whether Argentine exports pick up, whether the dollar gets stronger in world markets, and whether the Argentine economy in general can grow over the next year in order to be able to survive within this peso dollar range.
Thank you. Thank you. That was quite clarifying. And the other question I have, again, probably for an expert in economics is a very naive question, but it seems again that the condition of the Argentine economy remains critical, if not even catastrophic in many ways.
Yeah.
So my question is, how come though that it looks as if the inflation is going down?
Yeah. Well, before the current government came in under Xavier Milei, this self-confessed anarcho-capitalist, as he liked to call himself, he's come in with a program in which he is trying to get inflation out of the Argentine economy, which, as the graph shows, has been hitting over 200% on an annual basis until he came in. Now it's down to 50%. So if you're in Italy, if you had a 50% inflation rate, you'd be feeling pretty terrible and miserable. Argentines are feeling a little less miserable when it's down to 50% inflation rate because they've been seeing inflation rates at 100 and 200% annual rate until now. How's that inflation rate fallen? Well, it's fallen very simply because Milei's government has adopted a policy of catastrophic destruction of everything that's moving in the economy. So government employees, 30% of government employees have been sacked. There's been a huge reduction in any sort of government spending on benefits and other things. Taxes have been increased, and the economy has basically gone into a slump. So in 2024, the Argentine economy its real GDP was falling by 4% a year. So that slump has created conditions where inflation has fallen back. So inflation hasn't fallen back because Argentine industry is selling more abroad or producing more quickly. It's because nobody's buying anything. Both companies have not been able to buy so much. Consumers aren't able to buy so much because they've got poorer. So you've seen a big fall in the inflation rate. But now, as we go into 2025, the challenge is before the government. Can it keep the inflation rate down and restore some growth in the economy so that people start getting their jobs back, that their wages, which have been severely cut in the last 2 or 3 years in Argentina because of the inflation rate, and now by the slump in 2024 of 30% of government workers being sacked, and many workers, 40% of workers in Argentina are working informally. That means they don't have a proper job. They just go on a casual basis to get cash earnings out of jobs that come up. They probably don't pay taxes, and they may not get the work the next day. And these people have suffered severely in the last 2 years from inflation, and now in this period where particularly construction workers and other sectors have been decimated by the government's austerity policies, they also are in severe problems. So can this government turn things around? They argue they're going to be able to do so because the free market will save the day. They've got the support of the IMF, the very strong support of the IMF, to carry through its program of austerity and tax cuts for big business. And they hope a currency which is stable, and that will enable the process of economic growth to restore Argentina to some level of employment and better income for the majority of the population. So far, Carlo, that's not been the case. We're now, where are we? 5 months into 2025. In that period, it's still a massive level of poverty and unemployment in Argentina. The official figures for poverty have fallen from 50% to 39%, but those are official figures. They're not really accurate. And somebody worked out the other day that the official unemployment figure in Argentina is just 7%. But if you add all the people who don't have a proper job every week and are just precariously living from hand to mouth for jobs and other benefits, you're talking about 30% of the population. And the real wages are still well below where they were 3 or 4 years ago. So the situation is still dire. And everything now depends on whether the approach of the government, which is to slash government, which is to subsidize big business, which is to boost tax cuts for the rich. Is this going to turn the economy around? That is the challenge now facing the government.
Thank you.
Sorry, Paolo, do you mind if I interject a second?
Yes, go ahead.
On the inflation, because looking at this graph, if I don't remember incorrectly, I think Milei wins the election in October 2023.
Yes,
but it looks as if the real spike of inflation is actually after his victory. So I was going to ask Michael if he reckons that the initial plan to go with this full-on dollarization was relying on the basically destruction of the value of the private savings of the Argentinian people. So if letting inflation run wild for a few months, similarly to what I think happened in 1990 when Menem won the election before he went for the currency board, if that was part of a strategy that nevertheless looks like wasn't possible to implement. So what do you think about the fact that there's been this spike of inflation actually after Milei won the election? Because I am a little bit curious.
Well, I think as it were, the momentum for inflation was taking off during the victory of Milei, and up to then, Foreigners were not investing anymore. Money was being taken out of the country in big droves. Dollars were disappearing. The foreign exchange reserves dived as a result. So there was hardly any money left in the government kitty to finance any sort of program or to meet the debts that they've built up. So what happened was that the currency, the peso, dived really. So it's weakened incredibly, so that basically that meant that anything in the Argentine economy for consumers, if they were purchasing, or companies, if they were purchasing imports, and there was a lot of imports to purchase, suddenly rose in price dramatically. And you can see on the graph all these different sectors which took a huge rise in inflation. That was because of the election uncertainty. That was because the money was disappearing from the economy. Milei came in. Now, he was going to say, well, let's get rid of the peso altogether. We'll just use US dollars. If he'd done that, yes, inflation would have come down, but there were hardly any US dollars in the economy. So basically, everybody would have been dramatically reduced in poverty, not just the 50% or the 39%, which is officially the case even now, but we would probably talking the majority of Argentine people would be in dire poverty if you'd gone to dollarization, because they held hardly any dollars. The only people who hold dollars at that time would have been the very rich. So they would have been okay, but everybody else would have been in severe trouble. So that idea of dollarization, and also he said, let's get rid of the central bank. We don't care about FX reserves. We don't care about trying to control inflation. We get rid of the central bank. We just have dollars. That's the end of the problem. That was his campaign position, amongst other things, which were equally mad, but I won't go into them. But when it came to the crunch, he couldn't implement that. It wasn't possible for him to do that and probably politically survive. It would have been a dire situation, despite the fact that he won the election and had a certain degree of popularity. So he drew back from that. And he eventually turned against everything he said he was doing before to go to the IMF and to other countries to get loans, to do what all the other Argentine governments have done up to now, which is to borrow more to try and solve the problem that they have precisely at this moment. The difference this time is that they're not borrowing more in order to try and spend to keep benefits going, to keep government services going to some extent, which is what the Peronist governments would do. But because the private sector got nowhere, all that did was build up yet more debt, which had to be dealt with later on. So each Peronist government and right-wing governments before in Argentina borrowed more, got nowhere, ended up with more debt, defaulted on several occasions on that debt, had to have that restructured. Milei says, no more of that. We're just going to cut government out completely. We're not going to spend any money. And so this is the program of severe austerity, which he hopes will shock the Argentine economy into a better position down the road. Everything depends, of course, upon the private sector leaping forward, investing in Argentina, trying to boost their exports and in the areas where they have some advantage in world markets, and transforming the position that way. Will the private sector do that in Argentina? Well, up to now, all the private sector has ever done in Argentina is as soon as they get any money, they sell it, get it abroad, turn it into dollars and send it abroad and hide it in havens, tax havens and so on. That is a process of leakage which has taken place for decades in Argentina. Whether Milei will change that position, I extremely doubt. But we'll see, because he's going to the election, the midterm congressional elections, like in the United States. They have a midterm elections. That'll be in October. He hopes to be able to show the economy's better off and that he can win a majority in Congress, which he doesn't have at the moment. His party is a very small minority, and the Peronists and other parties dominate Congress. So by the way, he got this IMF loan against all laws in Argentina. There's a law in Argentina which says you cannot take out a loan with the IMF without Congress approving it. He just ignored Congress and did it through an emergency decree. Where have we heard that in Trump's America? Another sort of Trumpist measure to get this loan through. So he's putting everything on the line to transform Argentina in the interests of Argentine capital. He hopes to get away with this over the next 6 to 12 months. And there you can see the figures on real wages, how they've come back a bit, but they're still well below where they were in 23. You can see that the growth rate per person, or the total amount of GDP in Argentina has collapsed from the 2010s down to 2020. It's made a bit of a recovery since the COVID slump of 2020, but it's still way, way below. That's real GDP per person is way below where it was over 15 years ago. So Argentine people, on average, have been suffering every year, getting worse and worse for their living standards.
Apologies, but my StreamYard is having some serious issues. I look as if I was frozen, so I might have to step slightly back on the thing. Yeah, thank you very much. I was actually going to read a tweet from Christina de Kirchner, which basically was confirming exactly what you were saying. So now I had to close everything because otherwise my computer would have probably collapsed. But the title of the tweet was "Hey Milei, your Austrian economic plan went bust, and you basically turned yourself into another little IMF boy. So you had to do what Macri had to do in his previous government." Which is very similar. It was quite good. It's a pity that I don't have it anymore. Paolo, do you want to ask the other question? And in the meanwhile, I try to see.
Yes, which I think, for the little I understand, links back to what Michael was saying before, namely the fact that now Argentina depends on the IMF in a way, and that this dependence on the IMF has been brought about by Milei, in a way bypassing the normal procedure of the law. Now, this situation of a state, a sovereign nation, depending on a foreign and transnational system, bank system, or economic system, reminds me a bit of what happened to Greece with the Troika, right? Everybody remembers that. So reading the article, I couldn't help but thinking of Greece and of the fact that it has been made to pass, it has been presented as a successful case, a success story, as Mario Monti said. But for what I know, for what I hear, for what I read, for what I listen on various YouTube channels, the situation in Greece remains extremely severe for the middle and the lower classes, with a growth in poverty, in fact. And so the situation of Greece is catastrophic. My question is, can we establish a parallelism, a comparison between what is happening to Argentina today and what happened to Greece under the Troika? That's the first part of my question. The second part of my question, if this is so, can we take Greece as it is today as a benchmark for what will happen to Argentina in the next few years, 5, 6, 7 years to come?
Paolo, I think you're right. I think if you remember the situation in Greece, which, by the way, it's going to be in July, 10 years since the Greek people were asked to vote on whether they wanted to accept IMF Troika austerity in a referendum. It was a massive campaign. The media in Europe and in Greece to try and persuade the Greek people to vote yes to accept the Troika deal. The leftist government, Syriza at the time, officially was against the deal, but did no campaigning for it. But nevertheless, despite all the odds, the Greek people voted 60-40 to reject the Troika deal. The next day, the Syriza government accepted it, which is an indication of an example of how firm you need a government to be, if it's going to defend the interests of working people, as in Greece. And since 2015, now 10 years later, actually I'll be doing something on this soon. The situation in Greece, as you say, Paolo, has only got worse. It went dramatically downwards in living standards, and it stayed down. And it continues to be very, very low for the majority of the population. And that situation means that Greece has basically been in a declining position for living standards for the majority of the population for over 10 years. It was even before 2015, but for the last 10 years. And that the Troika deal has done nothing except revitalize to some extent Greek capital, but not Greek labor and working class people. But even then, Greek capital is still weak. And you're absolutely right. If this process of austerity backed by the IMF is applied effectively and it's no resistance from working people, the result will be something similar, that we can probably say in 5 years' time, at the end of this decade, that Argentine average living standards, particularly for the bottom 50%, will be worse than it is now. And it's bad enough it is now, because the whole purpose of this austerity program is to drive down the wages of workers across the board, so increase the profits of capital, Argentine capital and foreign capital, so that hopefully they will reinvest and take the economy forward. It's a simple capitalist program, isn't it? What's the answer under a capitalist economy? Get profits up so that capitalists invest. How do you get profits up when there isn't any much money around? You drive wages down, either by inflation, which is the previous policies of governments, and now by severe austerity, even if it's not so much inflation. And will that increase profitability for Argentine capital, turn things around for the Argentine economy? Well, it didn't for Greece, as you say, Paolo, and I can't, because Greek profitability, by the way, has risen quite a lot. Only Greek profitability in the last 10 years, but not Greek wages. Will it turn Argentine economy around? I very much doubt it. What we will see is a worse situation for Argentine people and an economy which is still in trouble with a huge amount of debt, which will be even higher now that it's taken out the loans that Milei has also taken out this last month.
Sorry, I hope I have resolved my issues with the connection. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, sounds good. Sounds good.
Yes.
I was going to ask you, so following to, because I could hear you fine, I was just frozen myself. So following what you were saying, like the situation seems to be pretty dire and not going to be resolved. I was going to ask you about whether you reckon that, because I think it's pretty clear that Argentina's got a problem of a twin deficit in a situation that is quite different from the other country that has got a problem of the twin deficit, because differently from the US, they haven't got the exorbitant privilege of being the imperial core of the world. But closing these parentheses, do you think it's prevailing as a problem, the internal deficit? So the fact that there doesn't seem to be a functional social contract between sort of like capital and labor, and then it seems to be pretty obvious that Milei solved it by blaming the problems of Argentina on labor, on the Peronist, incapacity to curb public spending. So if you reckon that is the internal deficit that is prevailing, and within that, which faction of capital or labor is more responsible, or if instead the main problem is the external deficit and the fact that they are structurally incapable of having a balanced trade, and therefore inflation is probably not driven primarily from, let's say, too loose monetary and fiscal policy, as the IMF would probably love to convince people that is the case, but rather to the lack of an industrial policy that helps building an industrial system that then balances the trade. So
I think you're right, Carlo. I mean, the whole history of Argentina since the Second World War, there was a golden period where after the Second World War, as in many other countries, there was an expansion of production and a sort of industrial strategy. In other words, the government directed investment in areas which hoped to develop the Argentine economy in agriculture and other industries. And Argentine capital was reasonably successful for a while, but it didn't last long. And we know in many countries, in Latin America and elsewhere, when we entered the period after the 1970s, when profitability of capital on a world scale declined, these countries, particularly the weaker capitalist ones in Latin America, were unable to sustain any sort of sufficient growth to keep living standards rising. Particularly bad in Argentina because what you had was governments coming to power under the Peronists, under Perón. Perón had a social contract. That was his idea. He had a social contract with workers. The trade union leaders were integrated with the Peronist government in many ways, and they supposedly provided benefits to the poorer parts and preserved government jobs and so on. But this cannot be afforded indefinitely without borrowing more and more. And the Peronist social contract just began to break down. And particularly by the 1990s, it's been a disaster in terms of trying to maintain any sort of economic progress for Argentina. Debt has risen dramatically, benefits haven't kept up with inflation. Peronist governments and right-wing governments, one after the other, have not been able to resolve this problem. Now we have what you might call the shock therapy of the Milei government, which is basically to destroy everything that existed before in terms of a social contract, reduce workers' wages to the minimum, reduce government to the minimum, and on the basis of that, try to provide extra resources for Argentine capital to succeed. So far, all that's happened is that the mining sector and the resources sector and the finance sector in Argentina have benefited from the Milei government. But the key areas where we would need an industrial strategy to grow, agriculture has been a disaster under Milei so far, severe problems, industry in general, and construction has been wiped out. So there's no infrastructure, there's no home building, there's no road building, there's nothing going on in construction. This is a severe decline in key areas of the economy, which would be the basis for an industrial strategy, is not materializing. It cannot materialize. My view is, as a socialist, is that the only way that could materialize is if the major sectors of the economy and the finance sector in Argentina was under the control of the state and the people and workers' organizations, so they could draw up a plan for industrial investment and production. That would mean breaking with the IMF. Why borrow more money from the IMF to do that? If the situation is going to be awful anyway, why build up more debt as a result, which in a way was Milei's original position, and now he's adopted usually the position of many other governments that Argentinians have. So an industrial strategy, as you say, is the way forward. But industrial strategy should be based on public investment, public ownership, and workers' control of that plan, not on just handing money over to incentives and tax cuts to big business in Argentina and foreign capital to sit in the hope that they're going to turn the Argentine economy around.
Sorry, more of a political question. So, do you think that the idea of the dollarization, together with the chainsaw, pictures, I mean, was the dollarization sort of like card played as a populist way to gain consensus from a population that ultimately who loses from a devaluated pesos is the person that earns in pesos. Yeah. So the way to get popular consensus for a plan that turned out to be against you, public sector worker, is to convince you that I will at least sort out the inflation problem. Okay. So the chainsaw maybe adds a little bit of folkloristic message and it's also probably part of a populist message. But do you think that idea of I will actually be siding with you, poor people, and stop this massive inflation was a key element that got him elected in the first place?
Absolutely, definitely. I mean, desperation on the part of the Argentine population. And they've tried right-wing governments, they've tried Peronist governments. Nothing has changed. It's only got worse and worse. And particularly after COVID, it got worse. So the situation has been dire. And so along comes this dynamic, theatrical personality, TV man, who also claims to be an expert economist, who knows what he's doing. And he says, I can get rid of inflation. I can get the economy going in 2 minutes once we wipe out all this corruption, all this waste, and so on, which rings a bell with people. They recognize this. So particularly those who are not in the organized movement, not in the public sector, but everywhere else, which is the majority. That was sufficient to give him a victory as a president. He doesn't have overall majority in the Congress. So that shows that there's still a big division within the Argentine electorate about what direction to take. But he won that on that basis, that he was going to solve inflation. Now he's going to go into the October midterm congressional elections claiming that he has reduced inflation, which you could say he has from 200%, as you said, Carlo, immediately after his election, now down to 50%. All I could say is if in Europe, if we had 50% inflation, you wouldn't win an election on that. But this, in the relative change for Argentina, it may have some basis for traction for his party to gain seats and votes. We'll see whether he gets a majority. If he gets a majority, then things are going to go really even harder. We shall see big measures being made to slash all the gains that workers have made, insofar as they've got them over the last decades or two, particularly amongst public sector workers. If he doesn't, then the economy is going to, the politics of Argentina will be paralyzed, and that situation will be much more to the point, to a tipping point, as we go into 2026.
Sorry, can I just carry on this note? Because going back to the idea of the plan, I was thinking that possibly a way that corroborates the idea that it was basically just an electoral move is the idea that I don't think that if I was part of the real oligarchy of Argentina, I wouldn't really care about moving to a dollarized system, because I would probably already earn my stuff in dollars.
Yes.
So if anything, it would have been more, I was kind of thinking like to trace it back to which factions of capital would favor which type of solution. And if anything, maybe more of a currency board would have been useful for other sectors that might earn in pesos, and would want to go like Menem style, a one-to-one parity, so that they can then get it out of the country. That goes on for 10 years. Then you've got the 2001 crisis. You default on your debt. The people that are affected by the default are not the vulture hedge funds that lend to you, but are the, my grandma, for example, lost some money as bonds in Argentina. It wasn't like, we're not talking about millions or billions of dollars. We are talking about millions of lira. So thousands of euros. But at the end of the day, it was the idea of a short-term way for some sections of capital that earn in pesos to get their pesos out in dollars. So in the first place, I really wasn't understanding a lot about the dollarization idea from a practical standpoint, if not for electoral reason.
Well, yeah, of course, you're right. I mean, well, I'm sure Milei thought that was one of the big solutions. Ecuador, for example, has a dollarized economy. It doesn't necessarily do them any good. Poverty remains pretty high in Ecuador. But you could say, well, they've got a stable currency because they don't have a currency. Milei wanted to go in that direction. His aim was to get inflation down and slash government. and all these other things come together. Now he's realized that we can't do that except by getting the support of dollar reserves from the IMF and elsewhere. And that the program that he's adopted domestically has to be backed by foreign capital, particularly the IMF and elsewhere. And he has to keep them on his side. He's trying, I think, probably to try and reduce the amount of capital flight there will be as a result of all these extra loans coming in, because every time there's been a loan before, it's just disappeared out of the country within a few years. I remember under Macri, they had $54 billion, the biggest loan that IMF has ever made to a country. One little country like Argentina, not a large country, 54 billion. Within 2 years, virtually all of those reserves have disappeared. And that is the argument that could well happen again with the 20 billion he's got now, plus the other extra monies, if they don't manage to stabilize the currency and keep Argentine capitalists from spiriting it out and investing at home. I think he's going to have a real problem doing that. But that was the electoral message. I'm going to be different. I'm going to solve all this debt inflation problem that you've had for decades because I'm going to get rid of inflation and I'm not going to run up any more debt. Well, yeah, he's running up more debt.
Just the very, very final one. So going back to the loan of Macri, 50 billion. Now I think it's like around 20, the new loan from the IMF. Yeah. So would you say that this is an indirect way to finance? I mean, maybe this is a little bit conspiratorial, but isn't then ultimately what happens is that you are indirectly financing capital flight? Because by giving loans to the central, to the state, let's say to the central bank, I think that's the central bank that then uses them, you will give them the ammunition to keep the exchange rate within the band, allowing capital, the Argentinian capital that has got pesos, to get the pesos out at a relatively cheap dollar price up until you end up the loan, and then you either go back and ask for a new loan, and then they're going to ask you in exchange to slash wages even more. So the thing that I kind of like don't really understand is, isn't this story eventually going to end up very badly? And how did they manage to go on in this cycle of looks like a stop and go mechanism?
Well, they managed because it's not always been straightforwardly downwards as the economy. There have been periods when there's been a relative boom. There was a big commodity boom from about 2005 up to 2015, 10 years, perhaps even a bit earlier, 15 years, where commodity prices, what do I mean by commodities? I mean things like energy, oil, agricultural products, beef, wheat, all those sort of items, copper, all those things. And many of those commodities are produced and exported in Latin American countries. Argentina is a big agricultural exporter of beef and other food products. And those commodities in prices rose quite sharply over the 10 years from 2005, beyond the Great Recession, 2008, up to 2012. But then they started to go down from 2014 and continued down and reached relative lows at the moment. So when you're getting a lot of extra dollars coming in from your sales of commodity exports, then you have some sort of breathing space. You have some opportunity to develop. But of course, in that period, the domestic economy didn't really do much in terms of a plan that you talked about before of developing industrial advantage for Argentina, which it's got a relatively skilled workforce in sectors. It could really develop that economy independently of just relying on commodity exports and the up and down of prices and that. But it hasn't done that, just like all the other Latin Americans haven't done it. Venezuela too. Venezuela boomed under Chavez for a period of time with the oil prices. When that collapsed under Maduro, now it's severely leaving aside the huge sanctions that the US has applied, which is obviously a big factor, but it's also due to the change in the commodity prices and not any real change in the strategy within the industrial sectors of those economies. And Argentina is like that too. So Milei's message to the electorate when he went into the election was, this is all going to change. I'm going to be different. I'm different from all the others. I'm different from the Peronists. I'm different from the normal bourgeois leaders that you've had in the past who do this and have done nothing. Now I'm going to slash and burn. And when I've destroyed, reduced everything to ashes, then the phoenix will rise of a new Argentine economy based on my brilliant ideas. This is his message. And he won the election on that message. We shall see whether that message maintains any sort of golden glitter over the next 12 months.
Paolo, do you have a last question, or we can?
No. I have no further question.
Then I guess we can probably close it here. Thank you very much, Michael. Sorry we left you. Well, it was long, but not that much longer than normal.
No, it was good, Paolo and Carlo. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks to you all for watching this video. I'm Diego and this is 99 Media. We are a collective of journalists, activists, philosophers and artists whose goal is to build a media for the 99%. If you want to support our work, please like, share and subscribe to our channel. You may also want to support us by joining our funding campaign at the links in the description below. Thanks again and we'll see you all next time.